All right, welcome back, and we'll just have two for this one. Now we'll be going over an article called "Changing Habitat and Habitat Use by Birds After the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill, 1989 to 2001." And this paper was chosen by Michelle Johnson. And basically, I'll ask one class member here. Michael, what do you know about the Exxon Valdez oil spill?
It was a disaster, I guess.
Yes, it was a huge disaster. And just a lot of oil was spilled.
Yeah.
And again, it was an area of Alaska which is known for being very pristine. It's not like there's a lot of pollution from cars and stuff on the shoreline in Alaska. And so it was kind of one of those deals that got a lot of media attention. It was in March of 1989. It got a lot of media attention because the area that it affected was so pristine, and it was such a huge spill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Exxon was clearly at fault, right? So, a lot of research went into looking at the effects on the shoreline, marine life, seabirds, and that type of thing. Now, what do you think most people would pay more attention to? How moss has recovered after the oil spill, or seabirds? Seabirds, yeah. It's kind of classic concern with environmental research is that it tends to focus on charismatic species.
Panda bear.
Yes, panda bear, exactly. Charismatic species. Polar bears, how are they being affected by global warming? Oh, the polar bear. Okay. Meanwhile, how many other types of
spiders.
The bacteria spiders. Yeah, exactly. Insects, beetles. How many other animals are being affected by it? So, anyway, this study did look at birds again because they're a charismatic species, and also they're fairly easy to count, right? So it looked at how many seabirds were present in different bays before the spill and after the spill. Now this is kind of tricky because you don't know the Exxon Valdez is going to crash, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of dependent on somebody gathering these data before the oil spill, and apparently some researchers had back in 1984. So the authors of this article say, in addition to their own data set, we were able to use nearshore survey data collected in the 10 study bays in 1984 to 1985 by D.B. Irons, J.L. Trapp, and D.R. Nicewander of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So you have the 1984 data, or before. Then you have the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and then you have the after, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, now if you were an average person, what would you expect recovery to look like after this disaster? How would you define recovery?
My bird numbers increase. It might get birds back.
Okay, to what levels?
Same levels as before? Or?
Exactly. You're like, well, if there were about 10,000 of these birds or whatever it is, right, in these bays before, then shouldn't we see a similar amount afterwards, years afterwards, if it's fully recovered?
Yeah.
And that basically was the definition of recovery set up afterwards by this trust that was organized after the spill, right? And they defined recovery as going back to the levels that existed before the spill.
Yeah.
Well, these researchers said that's not really appropriate because in these high latitude marine environments, we're not down here by the equator, low latitudes, we're at high latitude marine environments. They're very dynamic and they can change dramatically based on how the habitat changes and global warming and things like that. It's not like the oil spill was the only thing that affects bird populations, right? Yeah. So we need to account for other things that could affect the bird population, right? And so our count of these number of birds is actually going to be a function of average amounts of birds that you had before, plus habitat and habitat change and these types of things, right?
Okay.
So, quite frankly, they introduce a lot of additional variables that could affect the number of birds, right? Instead of just a simple before and after study, this becomes here's what the numbers were before, but after they're actually a function of that average number of birds plus changes in the habitat plus these other things. Make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about that research design? Well, actually, just go back to their definition of recovery. Instead of it being, the bird levels are back to what they were before the spill, they say that's too simplistic. We need to take a look at other things to estimate bird count.
I like the simple way. Like that just seems...
It seems pretty intuitive, doesn't it? Exactly, right? And so here comes the big... This research was actually funded by Exxon.
Really?
Yeah, actually, yeah. And so it says this is at the very end of the paper.
Small type.
Small type at the very end. This research was funded by Exxon Mobil Company USA. However, the conclusions are ours and do not necessarily represent those of Exxon Mobil. We thank the captains and crews of the various ships for help in collecting the data. And they go on. But at the end of the day, the research was funded by Exxon Mobil.
So that's why 7 birds is the same as 10 or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. And so they, like I say, they stake out 10 bays. They go around and they literally count the birds, these different species that are usually found in the region. They count the birds, and then they give these long explanations for why the bird counts may be different from what they were before the spill. And I don't know. To me, it all looks a little fishy.
Who's that?
No pun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Well, what do you think about that?
Just it being funded by Exxon kind of just taints the whole thing. You'd think.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it was good research. It seems like saying that explanation's too simple is their way of just
Right. Well,
I don't know.
What they came up with, what I thought was odd was, it said, of the 25 bird species whose status we evaluated, 12, 48%, exhibited no evidence of any spill impacts. So, about half, no evidence. 10 exhibited negative impacts that subsequently disappeared. So, they had negative impacts, but then, as time progressed, disappeared. And 12% exhibited positive relationships with oiling that later disappeared.
Oh, so the spill helped them, right?
Yeah, at least for a period of time, right? And so I mean, that's a pretty bold argument to make, that the spill helped out birds and marine environment. But anyway, The next thing that I kind of want to discuss is, and again, we don't have time to go into all the details of how their research was conducted. It's pretty technical, because, like I said, they didn't go with that straightforward approach. Are there as many birds now as there were in 1984? They didn't go with that approach, right? Yeah. They went with a much more complex one, so the research actually gets pretty advanced. But one of the interesting things they did was, when they were looking at whether certain species had recovered, they turned the amount of oil that was present on the shoreline.
Okay.
In some of their models, they treated it as a continuous level variable, 0 to 400 or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. But then in other models, they treated it as a dichotomous variable. 0 to 100 being no oil, and then 101 to 400 being oiled. Right? So remember I told you any continuous level variable can be turned into a dichotomous variable by cutting it off at some point, right? And saying, for example, income. Either you made below $50,000 or you didn't. You made above that, right?
Yeah.
So here they went, anything under 100 on our oiling scale means no oil was present. And anything above that to the top, 400, oil was present. What do you think about turning level of oil present into a dichotomous variable?
That's just another way of decreasing the amount of information people have about it. Like, when you do that, I don't know how much oil was there or not. It's just like, why? Just why?
Yeah, it can be anywhere from 0 to 100. And also, I kind of have a problem with the whole approach, because guess how I would classify no oil present?
No oil.
No oil present, exactly. Okay. I wouldn't say up to 100 you get a no oil present. I'd say no oil present means no oil present. But instead, 0 to 100, we're going to classify that as no oil present. To me, that just seems, number one, as you pointed out, you lose information. It's inaccurate. Is there a theoretical justification for cutting it off at 100? I don't know either, right? I don't know enough about oil levels and that type of thing. All I know is when I'm at the beach, I don't want any oil.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, oh, it's between 0 and 100, guys. Come on, there's no oil. Let's jump in. When I'm at the beach, I want no oil present, right? And so to me, that was a little deceptive, and at the least, I think you lose information. It's how much oil is present in an area where there's been an oil spill. To me, is a continuous level variable.
Yeah.
And it should be probably treated as such. No? Any question on that?
No.
All right. Well, it has been a pleasure. We will see you guys for our next articles. Make sure you get those in, and take care.